So without further ado, Bob Kaufman.
Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here again. I've come many years for the Conference on World Affairs, and it's a triumph of hope over experience that you've invited me back, but thank you. Tonight I'm going to talk about my latest book called Dangerous Doctrine, How Barack Obama's Grand Strategy Weakened America. What I'm going to do is lay out some of the major precepts of what I think is the Obama doctrine, and then I'm going to argue how that has played out badly in the three major geopolitical regions of the world, Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. I'm going to conclude by advocating as an alternative what I call a moral democratic realism, which is essentially a distillation of the principles of Harry Truman's and Ronald Reagan's foreign policy adapted to the conditions of the 21st century, and I'll make a few remarks about whether our current president-elect is in or is not in that tradition. So let me start with why I wrote the book in the first place. One, I seem to have a gravitational pull to writing books that qualify me for the witness protection program. Because my third book was in defense of the Bush Doctrine, which came out probably at the low point in the Iraq War's popularity, just before the surge, and I was defending it. I thought, how could I reprise that level of being Dr. Evil? Immediately I came up with the idea, let's write a book that argues seriously that President Obama has faithfully and consistently followed a doctrine that, however well-meaning, is deleterious and harmful to America's national interest, rightly understood. When I began this project, most scholars believed that Obama didn't have a doctrine, and that's across the political spectrum. Admirers of Barack Obama, such as Fareed Zakaria, argued that Obama was a pragmatist, not in need of any doctrine. Willin Bowden at the University of Texas, Austin, more critically argued that Obama was disinterested in foreign policy and reacted haphazardly rather than any consistent foreign policy framework. I think both of those perspectives are wrong. What I argue in the book is that Barack Obama had the aspirations to be a transformational president, not only at home, not only to rewrite the American social contract at home, the relationship between government and the individual, but to rewrite the American relationship with the world. And I argue in the book that President Obama has followed what I lay out in the first chapter, 7 precepts of what constitutes his doctrine with remarkable fidelity. And the essence of this doctrine is that President Obama believes sincerely that it is in the national interest for the United States to renounce the tradition of muscular internationalism that has dominated American foreign policy since World War II, reaching its apotheosis under Harry Truman, Ronald Reagan, and George W. Bush. It would be better for the United States to devolve power, rely on multilateral institutions, have a lighter footprint, and allow the United States to assume the role of a normal rather than default exceptional power in international politics. What I argue in the book is that this is very dangerous. Rather than regale you with the litany of 7 principles of the Obama doctrine before applying it to these geopolitical regions and explaining how badly it's worked, I'm going to focus on 2 or 3 of these 7 principles which contain the distilled essence of it for a general talk. Let me start with this point of departure, because I'm accepting President Obama's own words. When you read Audacity of Hope and you go to the chapter where President Obama discusses what was the formative period shaping his political life and who was the formative person who shaped that life. It was Ronald Reagan. Writing in Audacity of Hope, Obama says, "I came of age during the Reagan era. I am the anti-Reagan." And in many ways, temperamentally and aspirationally, he is. Let me start with this point of departure. Ronald Reagan thought he was an ordinary man leading a truly exceptional nation. Barack Obama believes that he is an extraordinary man leading a badly flawed nation that can learn more from the, I put in quotes, international community than from the Declaration of Independence and the success of the American social experiment. And that's my point of departure for introducing what I think the foundational principle of the Obama foreign policy is. And let me also preface at the outset, there's no birth certificate stuff in my book. Obama was born in the United States. Let's stipulate that. President Obama is a patriot. He truly believes his foreign policy is in the national interest. So let's stipulate that. This is not a conspiracy theory of how President Obama is secretly working to impose a caliphate on the United States. I'll leave to the bolder constituency of the left the Oliver Stone conspiracy theories that I've heard here on an annual basis. I don't trade in those theories. But President Obama believes sincerely, as his foundational principle, that the greatest dangers to the world lies not in the threats posed by our illiberal enemies, but by what J. William Fulbright called famously or infamously, depending upon your perspective, the arrogance of American power. It is American power. It is the unrestrained use of American power, believes Obama, that constitutes the greatest international danger. So restricting American power's exercise is not only for the world's good, according to President Obama, but it's for our good. Several corollary premises flow from that. President Obama's default position on using force, for example, is to rely on multilateral institutions such as the United Nations as the imprimatur of legitimacy. When critics, and I'm one of them, make the case relying on the United Nations for decisive action is like a second marriage, a triumph of hope over experience, President Obama's argument is precisely, if the danger to the world is the unrestrained use of American power, then multilateralism that slows us down is a good idea because it prevents us from acting as a rogue nation. And on the rare occasions when we can get a UN approval, it confers a legitimacy on our actions that we have not had, especially under the benighted era of George W. Bush's cowboy unilateralism. President Obama also believes that if the problem is American power, and if the priority is his domestic agenda to rewrite the American social contract, which requires a lot of money, it is necessary and wise to reduce substantially the American military establishment. Understand, for better or worse, and I think it's dire, how successful he has been. If President Obama has his way, we will have a Navy smaller than the Navy we had prior to our entry into World War I, when we were woefully unprepared for what was to come. If President Obama has his way, the American Army will shrink to the levels of January 1940, before Franklin Roosevelt's belated military buildup. when we entered World War II woefully unprepared for what was to come. If President Obama has his way, defense spending as a percentage of GDP will shrink to under 3%, lower than prior to World War II, woefully unprepared for what is to come. For all you who say, but we can't afford defense, look at our budget problems. Look at our massive deficits. Defense spending is not the cause of those deficits. Here's a history lesson. Liberal Democrat Harry Truman spent 13% of the GDP on national defense. Liberal John Kennedy spent 8.6% of the GDP on national defense and 52 cents of every federal dollar on national defense. Ronald Reagan spent 6% of the GDP on national defense. 29 cents of every dollar. We're heading to spending less than 15 cents. It's going to fall to 13 cents of every dollar on national defense. This is woefully inadequate to preserve the margin of military preeminence necessary to deter three very dangerous rogue regimes in the major geopolitical regions of the world. Putin's Russia on the march that we've enabled, the most dangerous threat of all, a revisionist, authoritarian, increasingly illiberal China that seeks to dominate the world's most important geopolitical region, East Asia, as we pivot, meanwhile, with no resources, and the pivot is really, in its essence, rather than its rhetoric, a pivotless pivot. In the Middle East, the withdrawal of American power has not improved the region, but has snatched defeat from the jaws of victory in Iraq and has catalyzed a conflagration that now has global implications. Without the catastrophe of Syria and the refugee crisis generated from the escalation and metastasis of that conflict, Brexit would have been unthinkable. The positive corollary of President Obama's doctrine that flows from the premise that the problem has been the arrogance of American power is that if we've been the problem, the corollary is we've been supporting the wrong people, and we've made our enemies by supporting the wrong people and by our hubris and by our arrogance. We've made our enemies a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the seventh principle I list that really ties together with the first one is that President Obama, even to a degree unique among the most liberal wing of the Democratic Party from which he hails, believes in his preternatural capability to reconcile America with our traditional adversaries. As his favorable biographer, I'm being kind, his fawning hagiographer, what Sean Hannity is to Donald Trump, David Remnick is to Barack Obama. David Remnick writes a book called The Bridge, where he argues admiringly that Barack Obama envisages himself as the reconciler of the races at home, a bridge to racial understanding. I make the case in my book that President Obama believes his presidency is the way in which we can reconcile a badly fallen United States with the world. And the corollary that we should engage our enemies is that we should put distance between the United States and our traditional democratic friends, because if we're the problem, we've been backing the wrong people and making conflict that we can avoid a self-fulfilling prophecy. Hence, and in my view, utterly perversely, Obama treats the militant mullahs of Tehran, who are virulently anti-Semitic, anti-American, seeking to establish hegemony, better than he treats a decent democratic Benjamin Netanyahu. Obama has sought assiduously, despite massive evidence in defiance of the underlying assumption, to engage Putin and make him a partner for peace in Europe and in the Middle East, while abandoning Eastern Europe, canceling missile defense, badly damaging our credibility in the vain hope of engaging Putin. While Obama engages Putin, he denies the special relationship with Great Britain, calls the Falkland Islands the Malvinas, indicating that he takes the Argentinian side of the struggle with Great Britain, returns the bust of Winston Churchill during the negotiations for the START Treaty with the Soviet Union, Russia, that allows them to build up while we have to build down and restricts our ability to build missile defense, essential for credible extended deterrence. Barack Obama was loose in compromising the intelligence of the British nuclear submarine fleet because propitiating Putin had priority. This impulse to engagement and this impulse to put distance between the United States and its traditional democratic friends is a foundational premise of the Obama doctrine, along with multilateralism, protection against the arrogance of American power, and defining the prime threats to the United States unconventionally rather than traditionally. Let me explain to you what I mean. Every president since World War II, since Obama, until Obama, even Jimmy Carter, and Obama is the political son Jimmy Carter always wanted, but even Jimmy Carter defined America's adversaries traditionally as nation states who constituted traditional geopolitical threats. I know this is popular in Boulder, but probably nowhere else in the world. If you look at Obama's national security statements of 2010, repeated in 2015, he defines global warming, not Chinese ambitions, not Putin, not Iran crossing the nuclear threshold, as the primary threat to American national security, and we should orient our foreign policy accordingly. And finally, before I give you a survey, grim as it is, of how this was played out in practice, Obama and his first Secretary of State, who is going to have more free time than she expected, not that I'd be rubbing it in because I take the high road, Obama and his first Secretary of State disparaged traditional notions of power that concentrated on what's known as hard power, military hardware, economic leverage, political influence. According to Obama and Mrs. Clinton, these were passé, and the United States could rely instead on soft power, updated by Hillary Clinton to smart power, the power of our ideals, the power of our culture, according to this line of argument, in a world in which unconventional threats were more important than traditional illiberal geopolitical entities. We could rely on soft power to substitute for the shrinkage of American military power, which in Obama's view was counterproductive anyway. I am a fanatical Beach Boys fan, so let's start off with one of their great lyrics to frame what's coming. Wouldn't it be nice if the world worked this way? It doesn't. Let's start with Europe. And let's start looking at it through the prism of the Ronald Reagan question modified to the 21st century. Let's take the major geopolitical regions of the world, the major power centers of the world, the regions where the greatest dangers to the United States lie if a hostile power were to dominate them. Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. Name your region. Are we more secure? Are we better off? Are we safer than we were 8 years ago when President Obama replaced the benighted, stupid, arrogant believer in American exceptionalism, George W. Bush? Not even close. Let's take Europe. President Obama believed, and still believes, that Vladimir Putin was a suitable partner for peace, and President Obama gave priority to cooperating with Putin rather than defending our traditional democratic allies when the two came in conflict. The theory was, and Obama said this, go back to what he said. What I do in my book, I use his words. I don't make it up. I use his presidential statements. Putin will assist us in establishing stability in Europe, restraining rogue regimes in the Middle East like Assad, and helping us deal with regimes like Iran. How's that working? Now, in defense of President Obama, even though I didn't agree with the policy, you could make a theoretical case that after the controversies of the Bush years, why not try a different approach to change the trajectory of Russian-American relations that had begun to deteriorate badly by 2005? The problem, in my view, is not just that President Obama had a misguided view of the world. It's that there doesn't seem to be any evidence that will have him change his mind, despite the evidence confounding that view of the world. Now, let's start with Vladimir Putin. When Vladimir Putin said in 2005, it's not a secret statement, it's in public, it's to his legislature. In 2005, Vladimir Putin said to his legislature, I quote, "The greatest tragedy of the 20th century is the demise of the Soviet Union. That is the greatest tragedy of the 20th century." That is the moral and geopolitical equivalent of Angela Merkel getting up in Germany and saying, forgive me, I need tissues, I'm weeping. The greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the surrender of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich 988 years too soon. Didn't last 1,000 years. We would say this is not a natural partner for peace. And yet we persisted in that. In 2012, President Obama went so far in this infamous event with a hidden microphone, despite Putin's mounting defiance, and it was picked up to whisper to Foreign Minister Medvedev on the issue of missile defense, foundational to the credibility of nuclear deterrence. Wait until after the election. I can be more flexible. I can deliver for Vladimir. And this persisted after the invasion of Ukraine. Should have demolished for all time the idea that Putin is a partner for peace. We won't even get into his negative contribution to the current fiasco in the Middle East. But instead of using Putin's attempt to subvert Ukraine's independence as a wake-up call to restore vigilance, Obama has resisted any and all measures that would effectively respond to Putin's attempt to use Ukraine as the first step of restoring some type of empire across East Central Europe. This is a moral tragedy. It's geopolitical folly. You might just sit there and say, who cares about Ukraine? The way you'd say, who cares about Czechoslovakia in 1938? I don't want to risk war, Neville Chamberlain said, for a far-off country. Well, we wouldn't be risking war. Putin actually is playing a very weak hand. He is leading a regime that is corrupt, demographically declining. The Russian population of Siberia, the resource-rich region, is vanishing. Russians demographically are disappearing. If current demographics continue, the average life expectancy of a Russian male is 58 years old. According to Nick Eberstadt, who's probably the best demographer writing today, Russia is heading on a trajectory to have 89 million people, down from 145 million people. The only segment of the Russian population growing prodigiously is the unassimilated, hostile Islamic population. There are more Muslims in Moscow, you may not know, than there are in Paris, where the French aren't doing that well. They never do with that issue either. So what is Putin trying to do? Putin is trying to do what many declining imperial powers who don't want to reform do. He's trying to expand his way out of his dilemma. And by adding Ukraine, the size of Spain, endowed with natural resources, with 48 million Slavs, Putin is trying to rewrite the balance of power in Europe and using its Russian diaspora to do it. As Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, put it, Russia without Ukraine is a regional nuisance. Russia with Ukraine constitutes a threat to the security of Europe. So the outcome of Ukraine's struggle for independence is pivotal to the West. NATO and the United States combined has a resource advantage measured in GDP of 17-2. And yet we have done nothing effective to stop Putin. No sanctions on the banking sector. No sanctions on the energy sector, the only two sectors that matter. We refuse to rearm the Ukrainians. Obama refuses to reverse his improvident decision to cancel missile defense in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. And consequently, Europeans increasingly feel, particularly in Eastern Europe, that the United States is no longer a credible deterrent to Vladimir Putin's ambitions. The credibility of American deterrence, the preponderance of American power, has deteriorated significantly in the 8 years of Obama in Europe because of President Obama's philosophy that you should engage enemies, put distance between the United States and its friends, and that the diminution of American power will contribute more than establishing and maintaining robust deterrence underscored by American military preeminence. And that's the good news of Obama's record. Let's go to the Middle East. I will focus on a few of the lowlights. I'm usually not a greater admirer of Vice President Biden, and if I start complimenting him regularly, it means I'm having irreversible neurological damage, so put me out of my misery. But I agree with him on one thing. Senator Biden said in 2009, I quote, "Although I may have disagreed with going into Iraq, we won a substantial victory. I have to admit it," said Biden. "The surge has worked, and Iraq may go down as a great success in American foreign policy." President Obama snatched defeat from the jaws of victory in Iraq, not only dooming Iraq to chaos, but touching off a regional conflagration that has forced us to go back into Iraq with diminished American credibility in much more difficult circumstances because of President Obama's improvident withdrawal from Iraq. Because of that improvident withdrawal, Iran used Iraqi territory as an autobahn to foment a sectarian civil war in Syria that has metastasized into a global conflict that has undermined American credibility everywhere. I'll explain to you grimly how that has touched off the current dangerous, deteriorating situation in the Middle East. With an American presence in Iraq, that would have improved astronomically the chance of an Iraqi regime stabilizing that was decent to its people and decent to its neighbors. Instead, we have a power vacuum, to paraphrase John Kennedy's words after his dissertation was rewritten into an anti-appeasement tome rather than the original appeasement version emblematic of his father's, while Obama slept to the danger of rising Islamic radicalism. As we withdrew from Iraq, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, and as President Obama was warned by his own people about the consequences and the rise of a then obscure group called ISIS, President Obama's reaction was, I'm quoting, first of all, he's wrong about his example. Obama said, ISIS, don't worry about it, it's the JV team to the Los Angeles Lakers. And anybody who knows anything about pro basketball knows that alone is disturbing. The greatest team ever in pro basketball, bar none, not even close, beat the Lakers 9 times out of 12 in the finals, the Boston Celtics. So the fact that Obama used the Lakers as an example is probably more indicative of its flaws than anything else. But Obama has had a congenital inability even to utter the name Islamic fascism as a danger, much less do anything about it. This goes all the way back to the beginning of his administration. In April of 2009, a murderer named Major Hassan went on a murder spree at Fort Hood, killing 15 and wounding 48. President Obama's Defense Department called that incident workplace violence, even though Hassan, as he was shooting, was shouting Allah Abu Akbar in Arabic. Now, you don't have to be Clausewitz to figure out that there is not all Muslims, but an element in the Islamic world Daniel Pipes calls Islamism or Islamic fascism that's fundamentally hostile to the West. We saw this repeated in Benghazi. Contrary to many people, I don't think the administration lied about Benghazi. I'm even more disturbed. I think they're telling the truth. Their default position, revealing their mindset more than anything else, is to deny the dangers of Islamic radicalism and blame it on us. Hence, when Obama took office, he went on what's called the apology tour that reached its ignominious apotheosis in Cairo in June of 2009. In the case of Benghazi, our first reaction, our default reaction, including the reaction of our Secretary of State, who again will have more leisure time than she expected, was not to say, hey, you know, it's 9/11, it's the anniversary, this may be a statement by our enemies on 9/11. No, it couldn't be that. We blamed it on a Coptic Christian video that may have been in bad taste, but this was a poor tormented soul whose people in Egypt were being brutalized, killed, rounded up. This was a man in anguish. We blamed it on that. But if you want the distilled essence of everything wrong about Obama in the Middle East, it's the Syrian red line that has had global implications undermining American credibility. look, a reasonable person could have said in Syria, as this war metastasized, given my agenda at home, given that Americans, or at least I am war weary, Syria is a bridge too far. The United States doesn't have a dog in the fight. That's a rational position. Or you can say, we have to stop this from metastasizing into a regional conflict with global implications, and you have to do it sooner rather than later, or the very existence of a moderate Syrian opposition is going to vanish. You can logically defend either of those two positions. There's only one position you cannot defend: what President Obama actually did. He announced a red line: Assad cannot use chemical weapons or he will face dire consequences. Assad uses chemical weapons, and immediately John Kerry, the Pancho Sanza to President Obama's Don Quixote, John Kerry immediately doubles back and says, oh, we didn't mean it. Any attack is going to be pinprick, unbelievably small. By the time Kerry finished qualifying what we were going to do, you would have thought that we were going to take the Syrian leadership by luxury Mercedes to sit out the equivalent of a power outage in a Syrian resort on the Mediterranean. And at the end, we didn't even do that. We said, we want to build an international coalition. And I've been to Boulder before, and all you Boulder people said, Bush, the cowboy unilateralist, we have to build coalitions. That's why we elected Barack Obama. You know what? George Bush had 42 countries involved in the second Iraq War, where he was supposedly a unilateralist. President Obama managed to round up one country to support his inadequate pinprick attack that would have combined the worst of all possible worlds: the French. Here's a rule of thumb. I teach military history. I've taught at the Naval War College. When the French are your only ally in a difficult endeavor, it's not good. Enter Vladimir Putin to fill the vacuum, and Putin's Russia has displaced the United States as the regional power that everybody else looks to, while Putin enables not only Assad, but the greatest danger in the Middle East that we have also enabled, Iran. This is the sort of distilled essence of everything wrong about the Obama doctrine, while he's demonizing Benjamin Netanyahu, who told the world what they didn't want to know, but they need to hear about the Iranian regime's aspirations and capabilities. We signed a nuclear deal that virtually guarantees that Iran's going to cross the nuclear threshold, tranquilizing us to the danger. Well, what do I mean by that? One, even if the Iranians abide by the terms of the provisions, they will be 6 months within 6 months have the capability to cross the nuclear threshold, if they observe it. Oh, what's the other problem? It's not verifiable. Why not? Because we don't have unlimited rights of inspections. We need Iranian permission. So do you think the Iranians are committed to fair play? This is a medieval jousting match. We can't verify the agreement. And even if we can verify the agreement, we can't do anything about it. Why not? Because we lifted the sanctions when the Iranian regime was hurting. And Obama says, well, they can snap back. Well, let's look at the particulars of that snapback. You can only snap back the sanctions if it's approved by the United Nations Security Council. The likelihood that the Russians aren't going to use their veto to snap back sanctions is about the same as my being a sous chef and an opera singer. There's no chance of those sanctions surviving Russian or Chinese veto. Hence, we are now not only on the threshold of the conflagration in the Middle East, We are also on the threshold of Iran crossing the nuclear threshold, which will trigger an arms race nuclear arms race in the most dangerous, volatile region of the world. Because count on it, the Saudis will, if they haven't already, buy a bomb from the Pakistanis. The Turks will cross the nuclear threshold, all because of the power vacuum based on the false assumption that you could engage adversaries rather than deter them, and the greatest danger to the world lies in the arrogance of American power. And the greatest danger to the United States is not even in the Middle East or Europe, it's in East Asia, where in a liberal, dangerous, hegemonic Chinese regime that for 20 years has been increasing its defense budget by over 12 to 15% annually, aspires to drive the United States out of the Western Pacific and dominate that region in the world, while the American military shifts and shrinks. Now, the answer is the pivot. We're moving 60% as opposed to 50% of our military material in Asia. But 60% of a shrinking military. A Navy of 220 surface ships is fundamentally too small to project power credibly, and we've begun to reap the whirlwind. Last week, the Philippines, our longest loyalist ally in Asia, the president of the Philippines said, I quote, "America's done. America's no longer credible." He went to China. They're the rising power of the future. Decent democratic India, with whom George Bush wisely forged a pivotal strategic relationship because of shared democratic values, our similar interest in constraining Chinese ambitions and dealing with radical Islam. We've neglected India. We've neglected Japan. We've neglected the Chinese military threat, emphasizing global warming. China has become increasingly aggressive in the South and East China Seas toward its neighbors, and our neighbors, our allies, are increasingly doubtful, not only in Asia but in the Middle East and Europe, of our credibility and resolve. So what is the answer? Let me quote Demosthenes. When the Athenians asked him back after they ostracized him, because Demosthenes told the Athenians, like Churchill did in the 30s to his citizens, what they needed to hear but didn't want to know. Demosthenes said, appeasing Philip of Macedon, who has insatiable ambitions, will fail. And the Athenians said, no, we have to engage our adversaries. We have to understand their point of view. It didn't work. And they finally brought him back in desperation. And they said, what should you do? And Demosthenes' advice was, don't do what you're doing now. And my first piece of advice is that the United States sorely needs a restoration of the first principles of muscular internationalism applied to the 21st century we associate with Ronald Reagan. Let me give you a concrete example how to deal with Putin. Putin and Gorbachev, or Putin and the pre-Gorbachev Soviet leadership, were in many ways in a similar situation. They faced an internally collapsing regime, and they had to face the choice of whether to reform or expand. China's going to face that same dilemma because inevitably you can't reconcile the monopoly of the Communist Party with economic dynamism. But when the Soviet Union faced that in the 1980s, they didn't face a power vacuum. They didn't face weakness. They faced a rejuvenated United States with Ronald Reagan restoring American economic, political, and military power. And when China reaches that moment, if you want the Chinese to reform rather than throw the dice on expansion, you want them to face a robust, credible, American-led alliance system in East Asia, underwritten with the preponderance of power so that the Chinese don't even think about it. You want a world in which the Iranian regime is prevented and not enabled to cross the nuclear threshold. We are heading in the opposite direction. So did the election of 2016 resolve that? Here's the good news. It's not all good news. Hillary Clinton would have been a third term of President Obama's foreign policy, which was heading in the wrong direction in every major region of the world. Is Donald Trump the good news? Well, let's be honest. At best, the case for Donald Trump is a huge gamble, because if you listen to what Donald Trump has said in terms of international relations, his foreign policy of America first in many ways shares more with Barack Obama's belief that the United States should no longer operate as the default power of the world than it shares with Ronald Reagan's. Trump's anti-NATO, Reagan's pro-NATO. Trump believes that the alliance in Asia, Japan and Korea, quote, he said it to the Washington Post editorial board, "We've never benefited once," said Trump. In other words, those who are hopeful about Trump are hoping that Trump does exactly the opposite of what he says that he intends to do so far. And maybe that is the case. But if you believe that Obama's doctrine is dangerous, and the dangers are gathering, and we are now facing three dangerous revisionist powers who we have enabled by our strategic and moral confusion and our weakness, you should not be, even if you don't like Hillary Clinton, especially if you don't, comfortable with Donald Trump. There is a potential silver lining. At least Donald Trump is committed to rebuilding the American military, which is vanishing. So if Trump changes his mind, and if Trump listens to the better angels of his nature, which in my view is Mike Pence, who understands these things, and which I am hoping, praying, would be John Bolton as Secretary of State, not just because of my agreement with him, but how much he would temperamentally bother people like the people who live in Boulder. That's the added spice, the added benefit of John Bolton. If Trump does that and reconciles rather than tries to enact vengeance on the Paul Ryan traditional Reagan conservative wing of the party, we can have a foreign policy that looks better than what Trump has said so far. But let me be honest, if you're from my side of the spectrum, if you're a Reaganite who believes that America must continue to perform as the world's default power, lest, to quote Thomas Hobbes, life becomes nasty, solitary, brutish, and short, you are feeling queasy, and you're by no means assured that a Trump administration will be significantly better than the disastrous 8 years of President Obama's dangerous doctrine. Let's hope, at least on my side, that Pence and others bring out the better angels of Trump's nature, which have been deeply concealed throughout this process. Let us hope, too, that Winston and Churchill turns out to be right once again. Americans always do the right thing after trying everything else. Thank you for your forbearance.
First, an observation. There's too many gray hairs here. It's your challenge as the new conservative scholars to get students in here. Most of what you said, a lot of people already really know the facts, and students would not know all the facts. So let's get some students and young people just to listen to your perspective. Second thing is you talked about which I really thought was spot on, about Obama refusing to change his direction and his attitude, even when the facts and everything is going. And I remember, and I'm old enough to do that, where Jimmy Carter used to think Brezhnev, I made a comment about Brezhnev, I looked in his eyes and he believed in God, Yeah, and then what happened, Jimmy Carter, when the Russians went into Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter changed his mind. He changed his view to the Soviets. Pretty late, but at least he changed his view. So at least he's better than Obama in terms of when the world changed, he changed his views.
Is there a question or a second?
I wanted to get your take on that. You're pretty much saying the same thing.
This is the good news about restraining the questions for a job interview. Professor Kaufman, how did you become so articulate? Is that what you said? No, I'm kidding. I guess the gist of your question is Obama even worse than Jimmy Carter? No. Because Jimmy Carter did that only for electoral reasons. And if you look at Jimmy Carter out of office, he was an absolute disaster and reverted even more strongly to the positions of his first 3 years. And honestly, we have the author of, I think, the best book that shows that, Steve Hayward here, who's a previous scholar, I think wrote the definitive book making the case that Carter is in that category. But no, again, this is a neurological symptom. If I say nice things about Jimmy Carter, worry for my health.
In the back row.
I'm a supporter of humanity, but I don't think nobody needs nuclear weapons. But you said what you said, kind of like this. So you said Iran is capable of building nuclear weapons in 6 months, something like that, right? What if they don't care about getting it from the U.S. and they get it from somewhere else? Because there's other people that got it too. Yeah, what about that?
Let me restate the question to the microphone. And tell me if I'm doing faith to your question. Can Iran get nuclear capability from someplace else? And is it an issue even if we don't help them? Won't Iran cross the nuclear threshold anyway? Is that your question?
No, that's not what I'm asking.
Okay, that's what I'm asking again.
They're trying to do with the U.S. If it doesn't go through, they can go to China, Russia, or somewhere else. So I said, tell me what you think about that.
Well, I don't think that's the issue. I think that the Iranians are trying to develop the nuclear capability themselves. And what we're trying to do is prevent them from doing that by restricting their enrichment facilities for nuclear fuel and their nuclear fuel rods and their centrifuges. And the way that the agreement is trying to do it is basically the honor system. Let me give you an example. It's like saying to somebody who's cheated on his exam 20 times, don't cheat again, but we're going to let you monitor the exam. We're not going to be able to verify whether you cheated or not. And even though you've done it before, you look like a nice guy, so we're going to trust you. My point is that dealing with a regime like Iran, that is irresponsible, however well-meaning, given Iran's unbrokered, unlittered track record of hostility, lying, escalation, and danger. Oh, look, the previous president of Iran said 6 things. This Holocaust didn't happen. Too bad it didn't happen. I'd like to make it happen. Israel, this is point 4, is only epiphenomenal, a symptom of the problem, and the real symptom is point 5. The Anglo-American civilization that is the source of all evil, the remedy for which is point 6, the imposition of a caliphate on the United States, structured along the lines of the caliphate of Ali. Now, people will say, he doesn't really mean that. In my case, if it walks, talks, and looks like a duck, it may be, and we ignore at our peril what the Iranians say and seem to do, the same way we made the huge mistake of not taking Mein Kampf, Hitler's odious memoir, seriously as the source of his ambitions to do what he did, which we could have stopped if we had used force sooner to save much blood, toil, tears, and sweat later. You know, your question is a good...
I'm not even, trying to cause conflict or anything like that, but Hitler killed Jews and Freemasons. So now the Nazis are killing other people, so that's the end of it. Another thing is that the United States trained the Sunnis. Saddam Hussein and Bin Laden, they weren't Shiite. Iran is Shiite. So, when you say, oh, we gotta do this or hostility, well, when they handed over Saddam Hussein to Iran to get killed and hung, the United States already gave, like, oh, here, so what you're saying is, I mean, you might be the president, but that doesn't make any sense.
Well, I disagree with this.
Let's get some more questions on the table, and there will have to be some smaller conversations groups afterwards. Juan, right here, yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to address the man with the gray shirt who talked about Carter talking about Putin or something. George Bush came back from a meeting with Putin and he said, I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul. Being an evangelical Christian, we can only assume he meant that was a good thing. I don't know how soon after that, but Hillary Clinton said that's an impossibility. Putin has no soul. So if we're talking about which administration is sucking up, and now we see the new guy sucking up to Putin as he has. And well, certainly was not Secretary Clinton who sucked up. I wasn't going to mention this, but you mentioned Mein Kampf. I'd like everybody here, when they get home, to go to Google and put in quotations from Mein Kampf and read them, and read about the big lie, and ask yourself if the new guy does not fit multiple levels of those descriptions. Now, my question is this.
There is one. Good.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for acknowledging that, the new guy.
No, I didn't say that. I'm asking, is there a question?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
Early on, you said that Obama did not approve of the unrestrained use of power.
Obama believes that American power is the problem rather than the solution.
Your words were, he disagrees with the unrestrained, your words, unrestrained use of power.
I think I added, no, look, I know my words better. Well, I'll tell you what I said. Obama believes that what he perceives to be the unrestrained use of power, which is a judgment call as to whether it's unrestrained or necessary. So I'm saying what he believes rather than categorically accepting Obama is right, that our use of power is unrestrained, which I don't.
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Okay. So therefore, he's in favor of restrained use of power. You have a problem with our policy being restrained use of power.
Well, one, on Hillary Clinton, let's stick to the facts. Hillary Clinton is the person who originated the reset with Russia. She is the one who named it. She is the one who pursued it. So while I think you're absolutely right, which is why I say people of my inclination have to be wary of Donald Trump because of Donald Trump's anti-NATO flirtation with Putin, I think that's a fair point. The argument about Mrs. Clinton being tougher given her record, I think that's a much more dubious point. And as for Obama's use of power, it's a disaster. His definition of restraint is my definition of ineffective. Look at ISIS. Look at the halting military strategy that puts withdrawal makes that the priority to victory. In the history of American foreign policy, the one thing I can tell you from the 1920s on is that premature withdrawal spells disaster. When we left Europe in 1919 too early, didn't make the world safe for democracy, made it safe for Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and Tojo. Reconstruction in the South after the Civil War lasted for 13 years, and by the way, I've made the case in print. That ended too soon. We haven't left Europe yet. And I believe that Obama's aversion to the use of American power is more dangerous than the alternative, and there's no perfect balance of us being the world's default power.
Was his withdrawal of troops from Iraq, was that more dangerous than putting a guy like Carl Bremer in there, an incompetent, to debafify,
Yeah.
whatever the word is, the regime? Did that make sense?
Yes.
Give him a warning?
It did not make sense, but your question is a non sequitur. Did the withdrawal of Iraq too early that Joe Biden had said provisionally succeed, unleash this torrent of chaos and make our position in the Middle East far worse than the day George Bush left office? Unassailable, yes.
Was not.
Let's let a hands up. So let's take some questions, please. Right there.
Yes, thank you. I'm inclined to agree with you.
Don't admit that in public.
And I understand, and I think Afghanistan has been another disaster. Built in 2008 is the war that must be won.
That's correct.
I'm still, I want to push you with this, because sometimes I'm tempted with this point of view, which is, I'm tempted by isolationism sometimes, because I think you point to this string of disasters, and I agree they've been disasters, but we don't get to see the disasters that would have happened had we had another policy. We don't get to see how things would look to us were we still involved in Iraq as heavily as we were several years ago. So it seems like it's kind of a comparison versus the disaster we see in front of us versus the one we don't really see. And so I'm pretty humble about my own perspective about foreign policy, even though I generally agree with you.
Well, we have some comparative experience that can't resolve it for sure, but can give us some probabilistic evidence about the consequence of withdrawal or the consequence of staying. We had World War II with the Germans because we left too soon, and we haven't had World War III with the Germans because we haven't left yet. We had peace in Bosnia, however difficult, because NATO still is there. And when you withdraw prematurely, whether it's from Iraq or Afghanistan or the American South after the Civil War before consolidating the peace, you snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. So if you look at the history of, does the United States succeed more by staying the course or withdrawing as a priority? And by the way, you can go all the way back to the war that followed in the Philippines, the suppression of Aguinaldo by General MacArthur's father, Arthur, where we stayed the course. He was the David Petraeus of his day. You increase your odds of success enormously by staying the course, and it's penny wise, pound foolish to withdraw prematurely. Can I prove that mathematically? No. Can I prove that based on probability theory and the annals of American diplomacy? Yeah.
Right there.
I kind of wanted to bring up Russia.
And I've often told you that one of the few good things about getting old is I can't hear as well. And I don't want to eliminate because everything I hear usually for my children is bad. I'm willing to risk not being able to hear. And that's why I need your face. It's not belligerent. I'm not above belligerence, but not
The idea of Russia, I kind of understand the perspective of feeling that Putin in Russia is an expanding threat, and that Obama has dealt with that ineffectively. Professor Greg Young here wrote a research on Reagan's perception of Russia and the USSR and their development of military, and that Reagan projected that as a dominating threat when the reality was their infrastructure and military did not substantiate that. Taking that to the current century, yes, Russia is being active in Syria. issue with, or just the difference in our perception, but if you could try and approach with recognition of that sentiment.
And I think the question is, there's a perspective on the Cold War, which I do not share, that we exaggerated the Russian or Soviet military threat, and they were far weaker than they were, and Reagan exaggerated the threat. I've written about this, and I respectively say I fundamentally disagree. And as a matter of cause and effect, and again, there are two of us who have written essentially the same thing on this central point. It is American pressure that caused the Soviet Union to collapse, without which the Soviet military buildup of the 1970s, the greatest peacetime military buildup in history, may have resulted in a different outcome for the Cold War, and the Soviet Union is standing. So Steve Hayward and I'm going to implicate him in this. Steve Hayward and I see the Soviet-American military balance fundamentally different, and see Ronald Reagan's buildup as the anvil that broke the back of an evil empire which otherwise still would be standing. Now let me bring this up to contemporary times. Putin has embarked on the largest military buildup in post-1991 Russian history. And this is happening at the same time as an American build down. And the combination of the Russian buildup, the American build down, the power vacuum, and Putin's aspirations, in my view, risk a perfect storm of enabling Putin's aggression, not only in Ukraine, but throughout East Central Europe, starting in the Baltics and Moldova. So, in answer to your question, your professor and I have a disagreement about the end of the Cold War, what caused it, and its application to the contemporary situation with Putin. What you would call fear-mongering, I call a Churchillian prudential warning, without which dangers will gather that could be avoided or solved at far less cost and risk. If you have cancer, you're better off dealing with it sooner rather than later. Putin's cancer.
Behind that yellow shirt, see your hand up for a while. Yes.
You've complained a lot about the existing situation. What is your solution to salvation?
That book over there has the question is, this one, I love this question. May I paraphrase? I've been doing a lot of bitching and moaning about Obama, right? And what's my solution? And I'll give you a thumbnail sketch, but it's brilliantly and compellingly laid out in the final 2 chapters of the book. What I advocate as an alternative is a 6-principle foreign policy. I did a version of it for Heritage on Ronald Reagan. It's called Moral Democratic Realism, that has 6 precepts. One of them is the importance of geopolitics to distinguish threats, the importance of taking ideology and regime type seriously to defend democratic foes, and to identify illiberal enemies as enemies rather than partners for peace. And above all, the United States must retain a generous margin of military preeminence. And forgive me, I'm a Beach Boys guy, so I'm going to apply this here. So that the bad guys know us and they leave us alone, I get around. And the final precept, again, you know, I'm not doing it justice because it's so well expressed in the book. The United States must embrace rather than reject American exceptionalism. To paraphrase Churchill again, the United States is the worst global power ever, except for anybody else ever in history. And if you do a thought experiment of what the world would be like in any major geopolitical region, if we vanished, and we're getting a bitter foretaste of what's to come under Obama, God help us, because without us, for all our flaws, life for many people, and maybe ourselves, because we'll never be able to insulate ourselves in this age. We can run, but we can't hide. If we don't want life to become nasty, solitary, brutish, and short, we have to embrace rather than reject muscular internationalism underwritten by a preponderance of American power. You may not like that answer, but that's an answer. And again, the author is good looking, articulate, the book is there. Please invest, and I will inscribe it to you.
Here, yes.
Hi, Professor. Ross Kaminsky from Littleton, Colorado. You started your speech by talking a little bit about Barack Obama believing that he was the anti-Reagan. Yes. Yeah. And I don't. This may be asking you to play psychiatrist, but why do you think that he thought the world needed an anti-Reagan, and is understanding that kind of a one-off thing, an intellectual cul-de-sac, or are there lessons to be learned from understanding why Obama believed that the world needed an anti-Reagan?
Is there something peculiar about Obama's psychology to explain why he was of the belief that we needed an anti-Reagan? Is that a fair restatement of your question? One, I'm very reluctant to do psychology. I'm very modest about this. My daughter is a second-year doctoral student in psychology, and I've received a lot of unsolicited diagnosis. And it hasn't gone well. Dad, you have serious problems. You have a lot of them. They're really hopeless. I'm going to focus on people I can help. So in the spirit of humility, I'm loath to examine President Obama here. I have some genuine empathy, but honestly, I don't think it's psychological. Barack Obama is a man of the anti-war Vietnam left. He's a second-generation version of it, and this narrative that it is the United States that is the main problem in the world was deeply influential to the anti-war left's takeover of the Democratic Party. You don't have to look into Obama's psyche. Go back and look at the McGovern campaign of Come Home America because of what war is doing to America and what we are doing to the world. There's nothing exotic. You don't have to go to Kenya. You don't have to ascribe anti-patriotic motives. He comes out of this anti-war new left Vietnam tradition, and he's a second generation version of it. And I think that's simply, and I went to Columbia, and he wrote this when he was at Columbia. I think I was the only person with a Reagan button at Columbia those years, within 500 miles. So there's nothing unusual given Obama's intellectual milieu of Obama having that opinion. What is unusual is how tenacious he has remained committed to it, even with the collapse of communism and the nature of the Soviet Union revealed to be every bit the evil empire that Ronald Reagan said it was.
Yes.
You mentioned a little bit earlier regarding Obama's propensity to not change in the face of evidence, and it kind of is, well, are you really naive, or are you doing this nefariously? It kind of leads to that question. Why don't you think, people are curious, why don't you think, in face of compelling evidence, that it sounds like there's an obliviousness?
Well, first of all, you're asking what accounts for Obama's lack of ability to change according to the evidence. And I think your subsidiary question, is there anything sinister to that? Okay, let me dismiss the sinister question. Obama has preternatural self-confidence. Preternatural is out of this world self-confidence, even by the standard of a politician. That is also true of Donald Trump. that the one thing that Obama and Trump share, for all their difference, is an extraordinary confidence in their own judgment and a belief. If you hear Obama, even when you say to him, you know, things are going badly, well, in the long arc of history, I'll be proved right. I think President Obama, and by the way, you have to have a certain sympathy for it, because you don't want somebody who gives up at the first sign of difficulty. And you don't want someone who drives over a cliff. And the issue, and only history will judge this in retrospect, is where do you strike the best practical balance between these two competing things of staying the course but not breaking your head against the wall and violating Einstein's definition of insanity. I think that President Obama's excessively deep confidence in his, I won't say infallibility, but his ability to see beyond what others see, is a source of concern when any leader seems to have that. And in that sense, if you're honest in a Republican, if you don't think that Donald Trump was a modest man to begin with, and I think the evidence is pretty good for that proposition, think of this. He's run the table. Every gamble he's taken has been proved right. Do you think this is the time when he's going to say, gee, it's time to be more humble and listen to somebody else? Maybe, but I think Obama's problem is not necessarily a political problem, but it's a temperamental problem that amplifies the other problem. But I don't think there's any psychology that explains this. He just thinks he's swell, and Obama's not alone in having that inclination.
Okay, the yellow jacket.
Yes. I think tonight Dr. Kaufman thought that Obama was given credit for the disastrous result of this election.
You want to give Obama credit?
That he was giving Obama credit for the disastrous result of this election. And so I was wondering, when you talk about intellectual and rational, owner of the left-hand bookstore sold Alinsky's Radical Rules. And you mentioned about rational and so forth. The ends justify the means seems to be mentioned within this. Revolutionary, not the other aspect that Alinsky puts in the first few sentences of his book. And so I was wondering at what point that you could elaborate how Obama uses Alinsky's book, and I guess he taught it in Chicago, and Hillary was invited to go to his school in Chicago after she wrote her book on the Reveille. Could you elaborate a little bit for somehow? I guess it's a question, how significant has that philosophical persuasion been within the last 8 years?
So is your question, how influential has Saul Alinsky's book been on Obama's goals and tactics for achieving them? Is that the question? I do not accept the theory that Alinsky's book is almost Marx's Das Kapital for Obama. Obama found certain techniques of Alinsky's, which, by the way, are not unique to Alinsky, useful for achieving policy goals that fall on the leftward side of the spectrum. But I don't see anything unique or sinister, I don't agree with it, but I don't see anything uniquely sinister about Barack Obama's version of liberal left progressivism compared to, look, I prepared Bernie Sanders' debate opponents. I'm from Massachusetts, home of Elizabeth Warren. Obama fits into that tradition. There's nothing really exotic. You don't have to go to Saul Alinsky to explain Obama. Just go to the damn Harvard faculty lounge. My cousin is... My cousin, my first cousin was policeman of the year in Cambridge, and he's on the bomb squad. So I come from that side of the tracks. And Bill Buckley said famously, and he's so right, and I know how low the Boston phone book can get because I'm from Boston and I'm an example. Bill Buckley said, "I'd rather be governed by the first 1,000 people chosen at random in the Boston phone book than the professorial staff of Harvard because of the nature of who professors are." If you want to understand Barack Obama, go to a faculty lounge of an elite university. The economists actually use evidence, though don't go there. Don't go to the hard sciences. That's too rigorous. Go to the humanities and soft sciences. And that's really basically the sensibilities of President Obama. I don't think you have to go to Saul Alinsky, and I actually think, honestly, that discredits the case. I did talk to the Pepperdine Board of Regents and Pat Boone, who, by the way, don't underestimate his intelligence. He's summa cum laude from Columbia. At the height of his career, he got the degree, but he raised his hand and said, "You didn't mention that Obama was born in Kenya." I think the evidence, you don't have to make sinister evidence up. I think Obama is an honorable man who happens to be fundamentally wrong about his view of history and the way the world works, but there's nothing sinister or unpatriotic about it. We just have a different view of what patriotism would mean prudentially for the United States.
I wanted to just intervene with two things. In case you're wondering, my plan is to stop in just a few minutes at 7 o'clock, so we have time for a few more questions. I also wanted to say, in defense of my colleagues here at Boulder, we have no faculty lounge.
I'm sorry, they meet in the marijuana dispensaries.
Without a court's correction, what kind of apocalyptic event awaits us? Players and places, please.
If you want to know what I fear most in the next month or two, I think we may well be tested in the final month or two of President Obama's administration. And I am very fearful that he is going to do one thing that I think he has wanted to do, and I think would be morally and geopolitically disastrous. And that is, if I had to predict the most likely disaster, a China threat in the Taiwan Strait, maybe Putin, maybe Iran crossing a nuclear threshold, maybe. But I think Obama is going to recognize a Palestinian state in the United Nations in an attempt to put the state of Israel on a course of delegitimization internationally. And it will be a terrible, counterproductive thing to do, and I hope I'm dead wrong, but I predicted it in my book, and I think all the signs are there that, especially if President Obama's agenda now seems to be vanishing in the ether, this may be the last gesture as almost payback for a man that Obama dislikes intensely and I admire greatly. Benjamin Netanyahu, the great, intrepid, brave Prime Minister of Israel, who tells the world, again, what they don't want to know, but they need to hear.
In the back row.
Talks like an isolationist. It's talked about making our allies pay more for their defense. How does that work with the military buildup that you also talked about?
If you're a traditional, your question, how does Trump's talk about dismantling American alliances or our participation in it fit with an American military buildup? Well, historically, you can make the case for it. I think Walter Russell Mead would argue, and has very compellingly, that if you want to understand Donald Trump, think of Andrew Jackson, who is a president who believes in American assertiveness, but in a unilateral vein and limited to direct threats to the homeland. From my inclination, Donald Trump's statements about NATO and the alliances with Japan and Korea are the most disquieting evidence of Donald Trump not being in the Reagan tradition and being closer to Obama operationally. The only difference being, and I think it's a virtue for Trump, if we were to change our mind, because I think we're going to find isolationism is a disaster that magnifies dangers, at least Trump's military buildup would put us in a better position to recover from that mistake. But I think anybody in the Reagan tradition looking at what Donald Trump has said is in deep denial if they don't find that disturbing. That's why, for me, I'm trying to be constructive. Donald Trump could help me significantly choosing someone who accepts the Reaganite idea, even with pressuring Europe that we have to remain the world's default power again. I'll end on this. John Bolton's the guy.
Okay, one final question. Yes.
So I think I share some sentiments with Spencer over there, but I wonder, I'm going to ask a libertarian question. I wonder what role regime change plays in all of this, and how it seems to me that a big rationale from the people in the Middle East that don't like America so much is that we play our hand a little too strongly sometimes, and affect regime change and things of that nature. So I wonder what your comment would be to that.
Okay, I'm a defender in regime change as a war aim, and it's the best of the American tradition. After World War I, we let the Germans choose their own government. That didn't go so well. After World War II, we said, to quote John Lennon, Hard Day's Nights, Side 2, Song 6, Vinyl Edition. It was about romance, but it applies to this. Not a second time. The United States was going to deal with the root cause of the conflict. Ronald Reagan said the Cold War was going to continue as long as the Soviet Union remained the evil empire, and his famous document, NSDD 75, authored by the great Richard Pipes of Harvard, there's a good Harvard professor every now and then, made it a goal to transform the nature of the Soviet regime by unrelenting pressure. Regime change has always and should be a war aim. Not the reason that you don't go to war because someone's not a democracy. But if someone brings war to you and the threat emanates from the toxic nature of the regime, if you want to cure it like cancer, you don't leave it. The reason why there was an Iraq War II is that we left Saddam in power in Iraq War I. The less decisive an outcome is, the more likely that you're going to have to fight again. And if you want to settle something like Lincoln wanted to settle the Civil War, you had to destroy the Southern planter class once and for all and make the United States, to use his words, a new birth of freedom, and stay there long enough to reconcile the people to accept it. And again, I'll repeat, the tragedy of Reconstruction is not that we did it, but we didn't stay there long enough.
Okay, thank you.